our last speaker, and always hardest to be the last speaker at a big day, but this is one that I know is actually very, very good. And it's Dr. Sanjay Mehta. He's an assistant professor in Division of Infectious Diseases, and his research interests include molecular epidemiology of HIV and tropical infectious diseases and their interactions with HIV. He's going to talk a little bit about his research on HIV transmission networks at the San Diego-TJ border.
So before I start, I just wanted to let you know, when I started my collaboration with Ramon in Tijuana, the first time we went down there, he was showing me his where he was working, and there was a whole bunch of construction going on, and it's like, what's going on here? Oh, I'm building a lab. And so he was actually building his lab by hand. And so now he's done it from the ground up, built the lab all the way through molecular epidemiology to analyzing the data. So it's a pretty impressive feat that he's put together there. I do what I say. So I'm going to talk today about HIV transmission networks in the San Diego-Tijuana border region. So first thing I want all of us to think about is, what exactly is this border that we have between these two countries? Is it a fence? Is it this fence that extends out 50 feet into the ocean? Because really, if that's all it is, it's fairly porous. It's the world's busiest land border crossing. There's 50 million crossings a year. Anytime you go down, there's people lined up on both sides trying to cross. And within a few months or so, we're going to be able to share an international airport as well. So it's really it's not really a border. And lest we forget, San Diego was part of Mexico a lot longer than it was part of the United States. And so even culturally, we're not necessarily separate. So stepping back to talk about HIV in Mexico. So in the 1980s, nearly all cases of HIV that were diagnosed in Mexico were individuals that had previously lived in the US. By 1991, it was still roughly 44% of cases were in previous US residents. So the epidemic in Mexico was just starting to take off then. By 2000, the rate dropped to about 12%, but it was still higher in the rural areas, where up to 20% of HIV-infected individuals in kind of rural states, particularly in Michoacan and Zacatecas, had acquired their infections in the US. And this is a little interesting. I found this data of proportions of individuals from each particular state of Mexico that had sort of proportion of individuals from a state that had migrated to the US. And you can see there's 3 states that have a dark brown color, which it's the highest proportion of individuals that are migrating to the US. And these states include Michoacan and Zacatecas. So again, these are the states where the proportion of HIV-infected individuals that had acquired in the US was highest. So again, we've been exporting HIV to Mexico well before NAFTA. So questions I'm going to try to address here are, can we demonstrate that the two epidemics are connected? The San Diego and Tijuana HIV epidemics are connected. And we would expect so. As I mentioned, the border's fairly porous. There's a lot of migration. Culturally, we're fairly similar in many ways. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about directionality. So is there directionality to viral migration across the border? And then I'm going to briefly touch on deportation, as Ramon talked about in the border epidemic. So first of all, I want to acknowledge all the projects that have sort of come together for us to even analyze this data. And this includes a number of projects in Tijuana, many run through our collaborators at Global Public Health, including projects that involve individuals that inject drugs, female sex workers and their clients, truck drivers, projects at Capacits. We're hoping to, in the future, work with the prenatal HIV clinic at Tijuana General. And we are in the process of working with a research project studying MSM in Tijuana as well. And on the San Diego side of the border, we work very closely with Dr. Little's Primary Infection Research Consortium, with Dr. Garfien's STAR and STAR-2 studies. There's another small study that we had put together in the South Bay looking at MSM and heterosexuals. And in the future, we're collecting data from some larger cohorts, the Charter cohort and the Scenics cohort. And hopefully we'll pull that all together to continue our analysis of the epidemic in the border region. So for the purposes of the analysis I'm going to show you today, we had 1,107 sequences that we analyzed. Only 76 were from subjects residing in Tijuana. And we had 768 from subjects residing in Tijuana, San Diego, along with 263 background sequences from San Diego. And so what we did with those sequences is we inferred a transmission network. And I'm not going to go into the details of how we did this, but briefly what we did is we took all our sequences and we looked at them and we built a giant distance matrix. We compared every sequence to every other sequence, and we looked for ones that were genetically similar. And those that met a certain threshold, we inferred a possible or a putative transmission linkage between them. It didn't necessarily mean there was a transmission that went between those two individuals, but it suggested they were along a transmission chain. And then we put that together and we resolved these connections together to build clusters, and we put that together in this map that you see on your left. And the map is color-coded by risk factor. So blue is MSM, yellow is injection drug users, green nodes or individuals are MSM individuals that also use injection drugs, and the reds are heterosexuals. The shapes represent the sex of the individual. So the round shapes are women, the square shapes are men, and the ones in between are either transgender or unknown. And then you probably can't read it, but within each node is an abbreviation, SD for San Diego and TJ for Tijuana. And when we did our analysis, out of 160 or so clusters, we had 17 that included individuals from Tijuana. And of those 17, we had 5 that included individuals on both sides of the border. So again, a small number, but again, we were starting with a small number of sequences from Tijuana to begin with, only 76. But we didn't basically find evidence that the two epidemics were connected. We had 5 binational clusters. And these are sort of pulled out on the right. And so you can kind of see that they involve both heterosexuals, injection drug users, and MSM as well. So kind of all 3 risk groups are involved. We actually were able to use the dating of these sequences, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, to kind of estimate when these transmissions began or when the cluster began. And you can see that on the far right, that the clusters kind of had a birth date of ranging from 2000 to 2010. So it wasn't like they all occurred at the same time, but they occurred over the last decade. What was interesting about these 5 binational clusters also is that they had a higher proportion of individuals involved in transactional sex, and they linked different risk groups. You know, part of that is our sampling bias, because we did work with a lot of, we worked with research projects in Tijuana that were involved individuals involved in transactional sex, but it's still quite interesting. To me, a really important point was that these cross-border clusters bridged risk groups. So 2 of these 5 clusters included individuals that were injection drug users and heterosexuals from Tijuana and MSM in the US. So sort of bridging all 3 risk groups across the border, which has implications for epidemics on both sides of the border. So then the next thing we did is we started to look at migration of the epidemic across the border. And what we did first is we built a phylogenetic tree from sequences. We couldn't use all the sequences because there was too many, so we subsampled them. And in this particular tree, we've labeled the San Diego sequences as blue and the Tijuana sequences as red. And once we built this tree, we were able to infer the ancestral sequences that kind of led to the sequences that we observed, and we use these inferences to kind of make predictions about migration. And kind of honing in on this, you can kind of see where you have an inference where the sequence is red coming in. So the ancestral sequence is red or from Tijuana, and then it transitions to a blue. You have a transition from Tijuana to San Diego, and vice versa. So when we kind of put all this together and put all these inferences together, we use a Bayesian approach. Dr. Kayan actually did this work. And we put it together and we tried to make a prediction of how the virus was migrating between San Diego and Tijuana. And the data, was consistent in that we did see that there was migration from San Diego to Tijuana for many years, extending all the way back to the mid-1980s. But more recently, we're starting to observe some migration back across the border. Again, a big caveat of this is in relation to the sequences that we sampled. So we have sampled sort of a very small subpopulation in Tijuana, but from what we've sampled, this is what we've been observing. So to address the last question, so what is the role of deportation going on? So In Tijuana, the HIV prevalence in deportees is estimated at a little over 1%. But what's also noted is that 77% of male HIV positive IDUs, or injection drug users, are deportees. And we know from studies of deportees that they tend to take more risks, and there was some interview studies that had suggested that these these deportees also have a feeling that injection drug use and transactional sex is more acceptable when they get deported, when they're back across the border in their new environment, probably because they're outside of their support system that they've had for many years. When we looked at our data, we found that we had 8 deportees involved in these transmission clusters, 4 likely acquired infections in Tijuana, and the other 4 possibly were deported with HIV, although our data were not robust enough to resolve that with confidence. So my little soapbox at the end. So we believe test and treat strategies will prevent further infections, or can prevent further infections. And my only point here is that if we do it on this side of the border, or we do it on that side of the border, it's going to affect the other side of the border. And so probably it's good to think of this as a region rather than 2 separate nations. And with that, I'll close. And obviously, this is a big project with a lot of collaborators, and both at UCSD, at the CFAR, at the AVRC, and the PERC, at Global Public Health, and then a group of bioinformaticians that have been instrumental. So again, particularly like to thank Susan Little, Davey Smith, Doug Richmond, Stephanie Strathy, Tom Patterson, Kimberly Bauer, Rich Garfin, and Antoine, Sergey, and Joel. Thank you so much. I'll take questions.
Questions?
That you might be able to see if there's any relationship with the strains here?
So that's an interesting question. So we actually are now working with the Mexican NIH, and so we do have sequences from all throughout Mexico, and we do see an interesting pattern where, so we know that migration from Mexico to the U.S. happens in particular patterns where, and I don't know these off the top of my head, but people from Jalisco go to a particular part of the U.S. and we see HIV connections between those in the same sort of pattern. So yeah, so it's probably coming back from the U.S. to Mexico that way. Yeah.
Where did the sequences come from in the Tijuana? Were they a convenient sample? How were they obtained?
So they were obtained in multiple different methods. So some were convenient samples. So these are all, the sequences that are analyzed here are all part of research studies. So these are recruited individuals. So there would be a study recruiting female sex workers, and we get those samples. So clearly that's going to bias our results, or recruiting injection drug users or clients of sex workers. We're hoping to get a little bit broader sample. So we do have data from the Mexican NIH that's a little bit more random sampled. We have Ramon's data that I haven't added yet to the analysis, and there's other data coming in. But yeah, it's still a convenient sample.